So here we go. All right. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Michelle.
Hey. Thanks for joining me on this call.
Yeah.
So, you know that I recently had some inspiration around the Berkana two loops model, and you have always been the person I go to when I have questions about that model. And I appreciated the bit of wisdom you shared for the blog post that I recently wrote. But I know you have more. I know there's more wisdom in there. And so I thought we might have a conversation about
Yeah, that's great. I think it's full of nuance. I think of it often, and I think of it often around the question, where is this system at in its necessary process of change, and who might I choose to be in the change that's happening? And even within that, who are my possible allies that I might not have seen as allies? They're doing something different than me, and yet it's part of the change process. So, uh, without further ado, bring up this freshly created graphic. How do you like it so far?
So far, so good.
So the two loops are the two loops because we have a system that has come into its peak. We're probably about here, and we can see that it's coming into decline. And this could be on any time scale. It could be peak oil and the coming climate crisis and the unavailability of the resource, and it needs to be replaced with something else. It could be a stage of your organization in its mission and a need for renewal of any kind, small or large. So what we need is the new to rise out and take the place of something that is no longer sufficient. So we want to hospice the old and support the emergence of the new. And there's initially that's the whole model, but it's evolved, and there's so much that you can start to say about this. And I want to start by saying that you'll notice that the loop of the new doesn't start right under the end of the loop of the old, because the actual little pioneering experiments that you need for the new to be born are not usually the things that the old system wants to do. They're usually the first people to see that there's something insufficient or there's something more creative that could exist. And they're trying it, but they're trying it in small ways that might barely be noticed, that certainly aren't sufficient yet to take the place of the whole old system. And so that needs a lot of the kind of work that we've both done in the art of hosting world, in convening. So you might be networking among some of these experiments, discovering the shared purpose and energy and rapidly learning and iterating because you're doing that. You might form communities of practice in here, and we've both been involved in lots of those. And then sometimes the people who pioneer something are not the ones that can actually bring it to fruition. You might need people with the particular skill set of social entrepreneurs to determine which of these experiments start to rise up. And then it's not limited to that, because look who's over here. We've got the people in leadership roles in the existing system, and ideally they become part of the two loops at the point that they understand the change needs to happen. And all of a sudden they are then, instead of defending and trying to hold on to, and often in futile or destructive ways trying to maintain something that is no longer the right thing, they can be the visionaries who, from within the system and with control of its influence and power, can help to hospice it and support the emergence of the new. So we had a great bit of a conversation a couple of days ago about, there's a version of this I've sometimes seen where there's a little stick figure drawn right about here. And that stick figure is frantically trying to climb back up the loop. And I said, don't be that guy. We tend to get stuck in thinking that things should never change, can't change. But if you are here, you've got all kinds of influence and control, and you can actually be the one who helps to see and to build the bridge to the new by maybe you're supporting some of these experiments. Maybe you're in a position to actually be, I know you're in one project right now, I won't name any details, where there's a possible funder of a bunch of connecting conversations that
Mhm.
are about how a particular thing could happen. That's an institution that has all kinds of resources. There's nothing wrong with that institution either. They don't need to go into decline. But there's a lot of resources here. Let's say you're an oil executive. Well,
Mhm.
your job is to wind down the fossil fuel industry now as quickly as possible. It can't die tomorrow. You have the expertise to shut it down, and you have the massive financial resources and influence to see that the new system that needs to rise up gets the resources at the point that it's ready.
Mhm.
And I'll add one more really significant role, which is you can be a storyteller who sees the whole picture and is illuminating the choice.
Mm. I wanted to ask, where do you live in this model? And clearly you are a storyteller, and I think you play other roles as well.
Great question. I've done some of that for sure. I think I've been mostly over here.
Mhm.
And we've talked, and we're co-teaching a course right now in which I've been able to tell the stories
Mhm.
of a number of the pioneering projects. And the pioneering projects partly are pioneering because we use the sociocracy sort of phrase of good enough to try and safe enough to fail. So there's a unusual freedom in some of these pioneering experiments that do not yet have to be enough. And so you can learn really deeply in ways that can then be applied as it's time to move up the scale. But I've sometimes been the person, I've introduced sociocracy in two different contexts that are ready for a more participatory and emergent form of governance. I have been a generative journalist.
Mhm.
I've rarely been in great positions of power, but I like to think I'm ahead at times.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And a hospicer, I imagine, as well.
Yeah. There's a beauty in that word hospice. We tend to think that everything we create needs to be permanent. It's sort of a reflexive attitude of how can we maintain this? And then in some cases, the financing and administration of something that is no longer the best thing become the way we spend our lives. Um, and there's a cycle, there's a version of this that's a figure eight, the eco cycle, that is a very similar model in which it is the natural, necessary cycle of birth and death.
Mhm.
There's a point at which things become too rigid and they need to change, or they become too chaotic and they need to find new, firm grounding.
Mm.
It
Mhm.
takes all of these roles. And so that's the thing about who might your allies be? If you're a pioneer or an innovator, you might see the people running the old system as the enemy when they might be your best friend.
Mm.
They
Mm.
might be the ones who understand the system well enough that they're ready to understand and help you experiment and be in a position to um, tell your story from a position of influence and authority,
Mhm.
and help transfer the resources when the time comes.
I really appreciated the distinction you made between those people who are visionaries and supporting emergence of the new, and those who are not yet in this model, who might even be engaging in predatory delay.
Predatory delay is such a appropriate term. And there are one of the other things that we talked about that I would love to bring back in here is think about what it is you're working on and which of the loops is it really gravitationally attracted to. There's an awful lot of play around the edges within the old system that is never genuinely meant to be emergent in the new. Sometimes it might be greenwashing. Sometimes it might be an experiment you're trying, not because you want it to succeed, but so that you can do communications claiming that you care about what that experiment represents. And if you're the oil executive and your actual motivation is what's the maximum amount of further money that we can squeeze out of this as we play a game of chicken with the climate crisis, you don't belong in this model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems like it's fundamentally a model of learning and living systems and emergence and evolution. So those who are still grounded in a mechanistic model of control and extraction wouldn't necessarily find themselves in this model.
I do agree with that, because we've also used the Cniven framework a lot in our shared work and conversation. And that's a sort of a management and administrative mindset in which you might not even know how to or recognize the value of the kind of emergent work, which is reaching into the unknown. You don't necessarily know yet when you're over here whether it will work or which part of it will work. You're in rapid learning, which is not a management mindset. You can't project manage that. You can't put an exact timeline on it. You can't promise the outputs. And if that's the way you've been taught, which it probably is, if you're a senior administrator, you may not be able to see what's going on here, how to value it, and how to support it.
Mm-hmm. I've seen a version of this model that names what you have here, building a bridge, as wave riders. Have you seen that?
That's kind of cool. Now, say more about that. Is that referring to these as?
It seems to be those who are able to make the transition, or who are on the journey from pioneers and innovators to supporting the emergence of the new. But I like the phrase because it sounds kind of fun. It sounds adventurous and positive.
There is a place of that you really want to be in, of continuous learning and adventure, which has got to be like surfing a wave. As a surfer in big waves in the ocean, or we've talked about the metaphor of whitewater canoeing as well, and the joy of riding a wave of continuous learning and creativity. And of course, this new is also going to become old and need renewal at a certain point. So you can extend this out continuously. And that's when maybe it becomes more like that figure 8 of the eco cycle.
And even when we embrace a living systems worldview, hospicing is not something to avoid. It's not something to be associated with failure, but it's part of the practice of life. And there's at least grace and wisdom to be found there. And we have a mutual friend, Vanessa Reed, who writes and speaks beautifully about the practice of hospicing.
Yes, she's got a gorgeous TEDx talk about the choice that a particular influential magazine in a particular field it was the time for its energies to feed into other things, which they sure have. I've got a project called Peterborough Pollinators, which has sometimes been extremely active and done incredible things with a very small number of people. One of the people most involved in that project decided that what she needed to do was go on and create a parallel thing called the Monarch Ultra, where it was an ultra marathon run from Canada to Mexico, following the migration route of monarch butterflies, that brought together ultra marathon runners and naturalists for education. It was an amazing project. What a great place for her to put her energy for a while. And the Pollinators is now looking like it's rising up again. We're meeting shortly.
Great. Well, look how much richness in a quite simple model. Do you have advice, maybe a last bit of advice, in particular for the building a bridge role? I think many of us are in that place, or at least I'm going to be joining a group who I think sees themselves as bridge builders. So, do you have any guidance to offer?
I think there's a lot to do with timing, and your model of soil as metaphor, and the idea of quorum sensing, the moment when the necessary nutrients are in the system for the soil to be fertile and the new life to emerge. There's a timing for building that bridge. If you try to do it before these experiments are sufficiently ripe, it will fail, and it could cause great harm. If you're here, on the other hand, maybe you can afford to try that more than once, or try it in multiple ways at once, and then let them support and inform each other.
Nice. And what about the networkers and conveners and social entrepreneurs?
I love that space too. And I think for me, you asked me where I've been, and sometimes I like to think sometimes about between spaces. The between spaces are, they don't have the limitations of the specific agenda and resources of a particular institution or project. Their purpose is rapid learning and interconnection, weaving together of ideas. And we're both fans of Peter Block and the book Community, the Structure of Belonging. He has this simple phrase: leadership is convening. Calling people together to have rapidly emergent conversations about a shared purpose. And the point is, you don't know what's going to happen in that conversation, what might emerge. And if the purpose is shared in a deep way, all of a sudden, I want to give you and you want to give me the best of what you know. And we see the ways that it could fit together.
Wonderful. Any last bit of wisdom?
Who do you want to be? There are ups and downs of each of these choices. You know, the pioneers and innovators, that can be pretty lonely and have a lot of scarcity associated to it. It's also tremendously exciting if that's what you want to do. Some of the really, really deep learning happens there. This might be safer to be in a position of traditional authority. Maybe you're a university professor or a senior manager of a nonprofit, and you get a reliable salary, and then you can use that for what you now know. There are many forms of storytelling. That doesn't have to be, it could be a book, it could be journalism, it could be poetry, it could be music, it could be the ever popular interpretive dance.
Right. Really good. Really good. Well, I'm so glad that we found this time. I think this was a gem of a little burst of wisdom. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks, Michelle. It's always great to talk.
You too.